screen. So let's have a look here. Recording. I just want to try and share my screen. Host disabled participant screen sharing. So perhaps if one of you can give me access to share screen. Wonderful. I'll try that again. Let's have a look. Oh, there we go. All right. So you should be seeing that now. Okay. So there we are. So title of my talk today is working with texts and semantic ways for teaching EAP. So I'm really here today more as a practitioner or a teacher. And I choose the term EAP practitioner quite carefully because it sort of talks about the role of, being able to talk and share my types of practices here today. So less so as a researcher. So let's get into it. So guys, quick outline of where I'm sort of be taking us today, sort of talking about the idea of an invitation or a call to arms for all of us here today. Then we'll sort of be looking or talking about the dimension of semantics in particular. And then I'm going to get into the nitty gritty of actually trying to work with texts using this theoretical tool and analytical toolkit. So I'll sort of be showing you the messy complexity of texts and how we might be able to work with them a little bit more in ways that will inform our pedagogic choices. And the way that I'm going to do that today is to talk about how I can use semantics as a way in to the text. Particularly often when you might be working with disciplines that are not your area of specialty. As an EAP specialist, I've done a lot of this, and so the tools that I'll be working with have allowed me to gain insight into this as well. And we'll go through and hopefully we'll have some time for a little bit of discussion. I'd also like to frame this as a little bit more of a discussion. So as I'm showing you any text analysis, if anyone has any questions or would like to engage or stop me, please do. I've got lots of stuff that I can talk about. So please, engage and let me know if there's anything that you'd like a little bit more about. So starting off the talk, I'm here today in the spirit of what is being called the scholarship or the scholarship of teaching and learning. So it's sort of the idea of an invitation, and it's often seen as a challenge to reconsider ourselves, EAP practitioners, not so much on the edge of academia, but as professionals, academic professionals that actually have something to contribute to higher education. So by doing this, we need to sort of make contributions to the professional knowledge. We're trying to shape practices, we're trying to inform policies, and we're trying to engage with students differently and ultimately accumulate our own social and epistemic capital and recognition. So sort of building our status within the higher education. And here I'm saying that the scholarship, it happens when we sort of bear what we do and we share it with each other. So I'm here today to exchange, to engage you in a conversation with, the Singaporean community here and others that have joined from other parts of the world. So the professional community of EAP, and hopefully together we can sort of build on each other's work. I know that I've drawn on people's work here to inspire this as well. So thinking about working with text, it's a very, very challenging activity. Working with discourse is really hard, and teaching and learning it can be even harder. So there's lots of features of the text that we often talk about. So we can focus on, what is it about the disciplinary genres, the discourse, some of the features of the language, the grammar, the concepts and the terminology. So we're sort of thinking of the text there as an object of study. It's an artifact that we're looking at and that we're trying to use. But we can also think about the characteristics of those engaging with the text. So we've got the students, we've got teachers, and we've got the subjects and the actors who are doing the reading. And so when we think about this, we're starting to get how much they know. Sometimes we also have the problem of, is the text actually appropriate to the purposes and needs of what we're trying to do? So lots to think about when we're working with texts. So my main question here today is, how can theory inform our practice of working with texts? My answer to this is very simply that it generates explanatory power. So the two theories that I draw on a lot are systemic functional linguistics, or SFL, informed by Halliday. It's a linguistic theory, and also LCT. So LCD is a theory of sociology. And so if I were to gloss it and simplify it, I might say linguists usually often look from the bottom up. They're looking at the words and the grammar, whereas LCT kind of looks at it from above, where it's looking at the social practices. And so together, these two frameworks are very complementary. Here's an example of a recent publication which draws on the two frameworks together. And they have a lot of dialogic potential, and they generate a lot of useful things here. So one way to think is that both of these theories individually, together, they help me understand, so they can develop the teacher knowledge of how texts work, which then informs on the teaching and learning of texts. So that's kind of like a bit of a scope of what I'm going to be talking about today. And I'll sort of be moving between these two sort of areas, thinking about, how can theory help us understand how texts work, and how might that inform our teacher, the pedagogic choices that we make in the classroom. It's a messy practice. This is an unfinished. The analysis that I'm going to show you is not perfect. Okay, it's something that has been put together, but that's part of what we do. We're often working with time constraints, lots of pressures, so we do the best that we can. So why do we use legitimation code theory? So if this is familiar to some of you, I'm sure that you've heard this. I know that so Letitia, Mark and Namely, I know that have spoken about this quite a bit, and I'm sort of contributing to the discussion as well. So what is LCT? Well, if I were to gloss it and simplify it, I'd say, well, basically it can reveal what's required to succeed, or what we call the rules of the game, and then it allows us to teach that to the students. It also aims to empower the teachers. It gives them tools, a nice set of tools for developing their teaching, because it's the teachers who are in the classroom and working with the students. And it also allows us to analyze and identify and show what kinds of practices work best for teaching different forms of knowledge to different kinds of students. So it's an extremely powerful and useful and applicable theory. The analytical toolkit. Today I'm going to be looking at the notion of semantics, which is based on the principle that everything that we do, all knowledge claims, all knowledge practices, there is some degree or some measure of abstraction, and there's some degree of complexity within this as well. So this principle is explored through the concepts of semantic gravity and semantic density. And these concepts allow us to ask the questions of, well, what are the forms that knowledge takes? And how do these forms of knowledge integrate, shift, change, and move over text or time? They're very abstract principles, so they always need to be enacted in a particular context. They always need to be operationalized, and that's kind of what we'll be working with today. So semantic gravity, the degree to which meaning relates to its context, or its notion of context dependency. It's a relational idea. So it can be stronger or weaker along a continuum of strengths. So weaker semantic gravity, we can gloss it and say it might be more abstract, context independent, and stronger gravity, so more context dependent. We can also talk about the dynamic shifts or change over time. So we can talk about weakening semantic gravity. So where you start to generalize principles from a specific instance or context or a case. And you may also be able to strengthen the semantic gravity. So that's moving down from the abstract to very specific. So the other main concept that we're working with is density, and density relates to the condensation of meaning. And again, this is also relational, can be stronger or weaker. So basically, the weaker the semantic density, the fewer meanings are condensed into an icon or a meaning or some sort of artifact. And it can be stronger where more meanings are condensed into it as well. This can also be dynamic, so we can talk about the movement over time, so the strengthening, so we can condense and put more meaning into a symbol or a technical term, basically the idea of packaging things in, or we can talk about the weakening of semantic density, so we can unpack it and we can have the various meanings. So An example of way that we might do here is the notion of how's this happen? So we can talk about, this is an example, a glyphly, it's an imaginary term, doesn't mean anything. And we can increase the semantic density of this term by talking about types of it. So we can say, okay, so we can increase the semantic density and say there's a glyphly A and there's a glyphly B. Then we can increase the density further. We can create more links, so we can give characteristics to these types of things. So we can say that, you know, glyphly A is red and glyphly B is blue, and this can be infinite, and we can create more and more relations between the concepts, which develop and the complexity increases. So this is often the nature of the very technical and the abstract concepts, which are indicative of the complex professional academic knowledge that we often deal with. So we can also think about how these variables map onto a Cartesian plane. And so we can often talk about the more decontextualized or abstract meanings, or the more concrete meanings, or we can talk about more complex and more simple. So this generates a code or a snapshot of the types of meanings, and we can then talk about putting them together. So we can talk about how semantic we can have more concrete and more simple meanings, which is common of everyday language and real world examples. We can weaken the gravity, so we can start talking about the idea of more abstract, but they're still quite simple in their meaning. So this is often the notion of genericism generalizations. We can strengthen the density, so we can start getting more complex meanings with abstract ideas, and we start getting the technicality and theory and the abstract concepts happening. But then we can also strengthen the gravity, where we can talk about concrete examples of complex meanings as well. So we often talk about the notion of specialized language with real world examples. So to sort of make this a little bit more, you know, tangible, I've used this when I've been teaching business, for example. So teaching on a Master of Professional Accounting, and the students have to learn the notion of a word like asset. So I can talk about the notion of a more abstract sort of, you know, go to a dictionary, here's an abstract definition, there's no specific time or place. And so we can show, here's an example of the meaning of the word asset up in the semantic code in the top left. Students don't need to learn that. They often need to engage with the theoretical text. So in the course that I was teaching, there was this type of definition which came in. So an asset is defined in paragraph 49A of the conceptual framework. And then there's almost a whole chapter that goes through the definition of this term. So we're starting to see the level of abstraction, the meaning that's packed into this text here. Alternatively, we can go down into the concrete everyday meanings. So we can see down here, we've got different types of assets. So your car, your house, these are all examples of assets. And then we can also strengthen the density, and then we can start talking about, well, these are concrete examples of abstract concepts. So the students need to be able to talk about tangible, intangible assets, for example. So the reason why this is useful is that the students do need more than one code. They need to be able to move across these definitions. They need to be able to unpack them. Okay, they need to be able to repack them. So they need to be able to move across these ideas here, and often in readings and in their writing, they need to be able to trace the movements, recognize the movements to help them understand and build their cumulative understanding and ability to work with this term asset. So that's an example, a tangible example of why semantic codes can be really, really useful when working with text and vocabulary. We can also use these concepts to talk about changes over time, which is where we get the notion of semantic waves. So we can talk about meanings that are often hard to understand. They're often abstract, they're often technical. These are the types of things that we're trying to explain in a classroom. So for students to understand that, we often need to unpack it. We need to think about concrete examples of this. So we might be decreasing the density. We're sort of unpacking the meanings in there, or we can give real world examples, which is an example of the high gravity. So here's an example of the wave. We need to be unpacking and we need to be repacking so that students can develop their understanding. What's less desirable for teaching and learning is staying at what we call a high semantic flat line. So this is often the language of experts. That's fine. This has a place. You know, experts communicate with each other. There's a reason for technical language. It's all about context. Okay, so there is a place for this, but it's often less desirable for what we need to be doing with students. Alternatively, we often have a low semantic flatline. And what happens here is that the meanings often get locked into a particular situation. We present it in language they can easily understand, but they may not be able to abstract the meanings out of a particular context and actually transfer them to other contexts. Another example of the type of waves that we do see in classrooms is the downward elevator. So this is where we basically take an abstract concept and then we unpack the concept. And once we've unpacked it, we jump back up to another abstract concept and then we unpack that. So we just sort of move through these downward elevators, and what we're not doing is actually repacking it for the students. We're sort of taking the technicality and we're dumping them in the everydays. And so again, there may be a reason or there may be a place where this is suitable, but as a general teaching practice, it's something that we want to be perhaps less, less focused on. Another aspect that we can do is we can talk about the semantic range of our waves as well. And the most important thing that I think I want to say here is that the semantic range often depends on the different stage of education. So some of the texts that we'll be looking at today actually have quite a small semantic range. But this small semantic range is in no way indicative of the fact that it makes it easy, okay? It's appropriate for the students at a particular level of their education. Others have a much larger semantic range, okay? So that's probably indicative of the types of meanings that they need to engage with at that stage of their education as well. So quick summary of that is that semantics are two main concepts that we're working with. One is the idea of semantic codes, which are the strengths of semantic gravity and semantic density. And these explore the principles of knowledge, and they give us ideas. They reveal the different forms that knowledge take. They are abstract concepts, so we really need to sort of translate them to engage with what we call an object of study. So within a text, what does semantic gravity look like in this text? What does semantic density look like in this text? And by doing that, it allows us to sort of understand the knowledge that's in there. We can also talk about the changing over time, so the strengthening and the weakening of semantic gravity and semantic density, and that's where we get our semantic profiles and the semantic wave, the semantic flatlines, and the semantic range. So now that I've sort of introduced the concepts that I'll be working with today, let's get into the texts. Okay, so I'm going to warn you now, this is where it starts to get really messy. All right. So I'll show you here, we've got three texts we'll be working with today. The first text is something that I have taught over many, many times in an English for general academic purposes course in Melbourne. So the nature of the students there, 5 to 6 IELTS, which I understand is quite significantly lower to some of the students that you may receive. So we'll be looking at the way that this text, the type of semantic range, the types of meanings that are in that text, and then we'll be comparing that with 2 examples of texts that were sort of shared with me. And the reason I wanted to look at this text was to get a feel for the types of discourse and the types of readings that you guys are engaging with, and that's being taught and learnt in different contexts as well. So it's a really useful contrast in the way that this works. Now, I had a quick look at this, and a quick comparison revealed to me that the first text, the red text, the irrigation text, there was a lot of generic language in there. There were a lot of abstractions, but it was still quite simple. When I compared that to the other 2 texts, the other 2 texts moved across all of the codes. So there were examples of technical language, specialized language, everyday language, and generic language. So the meaning structures, the forms of knowledge that students had to engage in had expanded significantly, okay? And it's really, really important to understand that it's the relation between the texts that allowed me to make this comparison. So another thing that jumped out at me, a very quick read of them, was the type of language that I was seeing. So in some of the texts, I was seeing a lot of real, what we call technicality. There was the technicality and specialized language. So what this is technical and specialized language allows us to construe the uncommon sense meanings of the world. So it's common in education, and we can contrast that with often the generalizations and the very specific situations with more common sense understanding of the world, or everyday sort of language as well. So what we need to do is to think about how learning the technical and the specialized language actually involves expanding a student's meaning networks. And we need to do that through unpacking and repacking of concepts. So we unpack through description and explanation. We're moving down on the wave. We're moving into a very specified, and we're trying to elaborate on the meaning. And then we also need to repack it often through definition and classification. So we're moving upwards up the wave, and we're starting to condense the meanings as well. So what I'd like to do today is to sort of take you through how I arrived at this. So the process that allowed me to get to this. And I'm going to start with the first text, irrigation, with the features of the generalized processes. So let's start with this. So I'm going to show you a way that I would often teach this text. Okay, so I'd like to start off by saying that I would support my students in this by using the teaching and learning cycle from genre pedagogy. And so this here is a pedagogic approach to engaging with text. So you can see in the center here, we're working towards the control of a specific genre, and it's also the critical orientation to understanding the way that this text works. How is it staged? What social purpose is it filling? And what types of language do you need to use to realize these types of meanings? So we often go through three main stages: the deconstruction and the joint construction, which is then followed by independent construction. So with this text, I had to do a lot of work on the deconstruction of the text. And having taught this many, many, many times, and the very nature of the text actually allowed me to include some joint construction in the lesson plan as well. So I'll show you how some ways that I was able to deconstruct this reading. So here's the text here. You can see it's, I'll leave it up there just for a second I'll just talk about the text as I'm going through here. So relatively shortish kind of text, 200, maybe maximum 300 words, not very long. But again, this was for students with an IELTS of 5 or 6. So for these students, yeah, look, it often would take them a little bit of time, and so I needed to scaffold their reading and understanding of this. So the types of activities that I would do is I'd introduce the topic, I'd talk about the purpose of this text, and I'd say, okay, this text is organized in a particular way. So then I would often ask them and say, okay, let's have a read of it, let's work through it, okay, and we're looking to identify which paragraph perhaps is the most general and introduces the topic, and which paragraphs give details. Now, that's a fairly intuitive thing for students to understand, and they were able to sort of understand what I mean. But then we can sort of get a little bit more technical. So once they sort of had understood what I was talking about, then I was able to sort of introduce and start packing in a couple of, meanings, trying to build their understanding of the text. So this was, drawing on SFL. So this is a classifying report, and its functions to classify and describe the natural and the social world. So this is often sort of looking at things like a scientist. So here it's looking at irrigation, but we could also be looking at types of rocks or types of weather. There's lots of different texts like this. It goes through the stages of some type of classification, followed by a description. And I'm able to show the students that's kind of what we're doing here. We've got the red block, that's stage 1, and then we've got the green block, which is stage 2. Looking at the language, we can see that there's some sort of classification happening in here. The technical term for that is a taxonomy, not a term that I'd use with the students, okay, but useful for teachers to sort of, understand what's happening here. So then I'd move into some sort of text analysis. And so this is an example of the types of things. Now I've shown you again the finished product here of what I did with the text. So I'm going to slow it down just a little bit and sort of talk you through the analysis that I did with these students. And again, this was scaffolded. It wasn't just off you go, do it. Okay. It was often I would take the students through it. So there was sort of, I'd take the students and I would do the first sentence and I'd say, okay, let's look at the first one. You can see irrigation here. Irrigation is a nominal group. Okay. Yes, it's only one word, but this is the focus of this particular sentence. And then you can see another nominal group, and I've got the little number 1 next to there just to sort of help explain to the students. And I'd say, okay, so here you can see that this is actually giving a definition of the term irrigation. So it's kind of unpacking the term irrigation. Keep an eye out for that when you're reading. And then I would sort of say, okay, then we've got a verb, okay, and I would continue through the text, working with the text in this way. So after I modeled quite a few sentences, I'd often do the first paragraph together as a group, and then I would sort of put them into groups and I'd let them work through the text a little bit, always with guided questions and monitoring and going around and checking and seeing how they worked with that. Don't underestimate the power of this type of analysis. It doesn't need to be perfect, okay, but it can be really, really useful for you to see how well the students are actually understanding this. I've done this with some classes that got this. We got through it in 5 or 10 minutes. I've been with other classes, it's taken us 40 minutes to do this, okay? So once again, it all depends on the context and the students that you're working with. Another way in to this text was to draw on the notion of semantics. So if students were struggling a little bit with that analysis, I would often bring this in a little bit earlier. Okay, so I'd say, okay, it's a bit complex. Let's step it back. Let's think about another way to look at it. I can show it to you visually of what's happening is kind of a wave. So I could say we've kind of got this generalized idea here, which you can see in sentence 1. It's on irrigation. And as we move through the text, you can see that it's starting to be a little bit more specific. It's starting to talk about forms of irrigation or irrigation technology. And so you can see we've moved from section 1 and the 1.3, which was the description, the classification of what we're looking at. And then we move into paragraphs 2 and 3, which is the description of what we're doing. Now, this was very intuitive for students because they could kind of see that, and it kind of allowed them a way into the text. It's just an alternative way of working with text, but it seems to work, and students really sort of gravitate towards this, this way of looking at texts. So what this then allowed us to do was to move on to a stage of reconstruction. Again, depending on the time, you know, I didn't always do this, but one time I was able to do it, the students got it. So you can see on the left, we were able to sort of map that wave structure into the column on the far left. And then together we worked through the text, we worked on paraphrasing, we worked on unpacking the meanings, paraphrasing, writing it up together on the board. So I did the writing, I was in control, but I'd be working with the students. And then we got the student, we rewrote it together, we reconstructed the text as a class, a joint reconstruction, basically modeling to students the processes of what they need to go through, unpacking a text, identifying structure, language features, identifying the types of meanings in the text, paraphrasing it, and then repackaging it in a form that was, you know, intelligible and appropriate to their particular level there. So if I were to summarize what was happening in this text, there's a semantic structure. What's happening? It's a fairly simple concept. It's irrigation. It's a fairly simple taxonomy. It's talking about 4 methods or types of irrigation. And when we're looking at the language in there, they're mainly generalized concepts. So I can point this out to the students, often plural forms, crops, channels, fields, or it's uncountable nouns, okay, so water, etc. So the nature of this text, it's often more general than specific, which is suggesting that the semantic gravity is quite weak here. It's quite general. There's some classification. Okay, so there's types, methods of irrigation, direct rainflow and smaller pipes. So the degree of complexity here relative to the context. So for these students, those classification presented complexity for them at that stage. Okay, now for other students, we might look at this and go, yeah, that's not really very complex at all. So it's always relational, and that's a very important part of working with this. So I could also map this out here. So you can kind of see here the irrigation text. It's really working at a generalized level. There is a wave, okay? The wave that is there may look small, but depending on the students I was working with, there may need a lot of unpacking of the types of meanings there. So I'd just like to sort of use that as a benchmark and a comparison to the types of text that we may deal with in other context. So when I'm moving into disciplinary texts as well, I'm looking at different types of semantic structures, different types of meaning that are in there. Okay, so you may remember before I was talking about how it moved from just this generic, we're starting to move into the abstract as well. So these are the texts that I had a look at, and first thing that struck me, much higher levels of text complexity. The genre is more, it's a complete genre. There's macro genres, it's much longer. Discourse is much, much more complex, and the vocabulary and grammar is highly complex as well. I would assume that the students engaging with these texts have much higher levels of literacy, but this does not guarantee that it's accessible to all the students, and it definitely wasn't accessible to me when I first read it. So what is it about this text? I was using semantics to kind of get into it, to try and understand it a little bit here. So what I was noticing was that there were shifts in semantic gravity and there were shifts in semantic density. So what I'm showing here is the sort of like a heuristic, okay, very simple explanation of what the different codes look like and the semantic structures. So we can say, for example, that we can have meanings that are very abstract and complex, which are conceptual, they're theoretical. The way in which these meanings are related is often very integrated, and it's often a hierarchical network. Okay, so we need to understand the relations between all of the complex ideas to understand theory. Alternatively, we can go down into the practical. So the characterization of a practical knowledge structure is that it's often sequential, what happens step by step. Okay, so often there's no hierarchy or less hierarchy, and there's not a lot of interrelation that's happening in these knowledge structures as well. Now, the novices. So the first text that we look at was the semantic gravity was quite weak, semantic density was quite weak as well. It was very loosely organized. We kind of had that node in the center. Okay, the concepts are not necessarily complexly linked. Okay, and then we can also talk about the professional. Now, the professional is often someone who can actually move across all of these different codes. So the professional can integrate the theoretical with the practical, and they can derive practice from the theory to inform what they're able to do. So really what's happening is, compared to the first text, we're seeing big shifts, big changes in these texts, and they move across. So we see a big strength in semantic density, moving it into the theoretical realm, but we also see elements of strengthening of the semantic gravity, which is bringing us into specific examples as well. And so using this conceptual idea, I was able to use semantics as a way into this text. Okay, so I'm not a specialist in legal and ethical moral discourse. I'm not a specialist in medical discourse, but I can use these tools to help me understand them, to access them, and to conceptualize ways that I would be able to teach them and that my students would be able to learn them. So the way that I would do this is to start by identifying what are the semantic structures that are happening in here, and how can I see this? So looking at semantic codes, and I'm looking for the types of meanings and the forms of knowledge. Once I have that, then I can look at the waves and I can see, okay, how are these different meanings woven together as I read through the text? So very often this is what we're doing when we're looking at these. We're using shifts, we're looking at the concepts, we're looking at the meanings in the text, and we're making pedagogic choices often before the classroom and on the fly in the classroom when we're working with these texts. Okay, so this particular text, it expanded. So the students were not just looking at generalized processes, they're starting to look at specialized language, and they're also looking at specific professionals. So I'm going to show you how this played out in this particular text. Okay, so this text began with quite a cute little sort of love story. It all began here in a bar in Singapore in 1995. A young English woman met a Cuban jazz musician. They fell in love. They traveled through Asia. So what I noticed here was the key language features here as there's a narrative. It's a story genre. And so I was seeing that there was an introduction and there was a description, the specific setting, Singapore, a bar, specific time, 1995, periods of time, 3 years, introduction to the characters, the descriptions of the characteristics and the types of characters. There were human participants, so people doing things in this particular section of the text. And there was a sequence of events in the past tense. So one way that I might work with the meanings here with students is to sort of say, okay, let's just slow down, let's have a look here, and let's identify who did what, where, when. Okay, and you can kind of see that I've got some color coding there to sort of show the students and make this visible, the types of meanings that are happening here. So I could say here that in terms of the coding, we've got relatively strong semantic gravity, or we're starting with a stronger semantic gravity. It's specific places and people and times, and there's not a lot of density happening here. There's not a lot of meaning packaged into anything here. Okay, now, at the end of the introduction, there's a shift, and we can see this shift, okay? There's both a legal saga and a love story. It serves to remind us that whatever our leanings, the assisted dying debate remains an irreducibly human issue. It follows that we must summon all the compassion and kindness in our hearts when broaching the matter. So the key language features that I was seeing here was there was a move from the characters in the narrative to a we and an us. So it seems to be trying to appeal to the reader, sort of a reference to the common man, the general public, whoever the reader is. Change in the verb tense, so change from the past to the present. So in some ways it's making this more relevant to the here and the now. The subjects, the participants have changed. There's mostly non-human abstract participants, legal saga, leaning, debate, issue here, compassion, kindness, and there's also an emotional charging happening in here. Another thing I noticed was that this is what's the function of this change, this shift in the language, is really to interpret the significance of the narrative and the story, and it sort of acts as a springboard into the rest of the text. So in terms of what's happening here, the semantic gravity had weakened, it started to generalize, it started to abstract a little bit away from it, and the semantic density, the meanings are starting to increase. And from here on in, it just snowballs. It starts to get more and more specialized and more complex. Okay, so we start to see the operationalization of specialized definitions. So before we can go any further in the text, we need to look at, okay, well, from the perspective of a medical practitioner, there's a discernible difference between killing and letting die. Okay, so then we start getting these specialized terminology coming through here. So what's happening, if the key language features are telling me that we need to define the key concepts for the medical practitioners. There's a complexity in the noun groups that is required to be more specific and more accurate. And we're moving away from this common sense sort of everyday understanding of killing and letting die to a more uncommon sense taxonomy of basically types of death here. Okay, and this is significant for in sort of the text and the knowledge that we're building as we move through this text. So again, we can see here that there's a further weakening. We're moving into even more sort of decontextualized ideas, more generalizations, and we're also continuing to strengthen the semantic density here. We then moved into the next section, and the next section really started coming on quite heavy with the legal discourse. So the involvement of legal rights arises only in relation to accelerating death. The manner of such termination is also of legal significance. Death can be induced either by an act or an omission, and the common law has long recognized. So the language features that were jumping out at me here is that we've got this very specialized, uncommon sense terminology that's specific to the field of law. Okay, now I can understand involvement. Involvement means you need to sort of be involved, but involvement of legal rights has a much more complex understanding of the meanings. So I can understand it, but I don't really understand it because I need to be a member of that field with the knowledge base to be able to interpret and understand what that means in this context. So again, we've got these abstract ideas, abstractions as participants rather than people, which is indicative of that idea of moving from the here and now into uncommon sense. So here there's an increasing need for me to unpack meaning. So if I'm working with this text, I want to see that students can actually understand this. If they don't understand this, then we need to work with it. Now, I cannot assume, I'm not sure. Some students would know this, and it often depends what came before. Again, we've got weakening of semantic gravity, and we've got a strengthening of semantic density. So these meanings that are in there are very dense. Another feature that I saw as we were going through is the notion of boosting. Okay, so what I mean by boosting is that we're sort of including references. So these references are often to specific legal principles or respected persons or people within the field. Now, key language features, there's uncommon sense classification of the legal acts and statutes. So under S3(1) of the AMD Act. So as a non-specialist in the field, I have little understanding of what this is referring to. With a little bit of exposure to the field, we can sort of have a guess at it, or we can ultimately Google it and find out what AMD means. But it's not an intuitive understanding here. Another thing I noticed was the selection of the people. So it was very careful selection of obviously what must be renowned or notable actors from the field. And these would be unknown to the initiated. So I can read that and say, oh, the recent thinkers of common law, retired English Judge Leonard Hoffman. I understand those words, but I do not understand why this person is notable in the field. Okay. So actually what's happening here is we have an inverse relationship. So we actually have a strengthening of the semantic gravity. It's being specific here, but at the same time, and conversely, the semantic density continues to increase. So this is a really interesting way where you can see that the semantic gravity and the semantic density can move together, which is what we've seen previously, okay? But we can also see that they can work independently as well. So really interesting for me to kind of see that, to think about the waving here. So although this is waving down and it's unpacking some sort of concepts, I would need to do further unpacking to explain the meaning of these particular, why they're included in the text. There are also legal concepts and principles were contextualized. So these are just some more examples from the text, and the key language features here. There's specific cases, Washington, Glucksburg, and there's also the specific rulings. So in Colombia was decriminalized by the Constitutional Court. It's very highly specialized field-specific knowledge that's happening here. So, there's a reason why these have been selected, because they unpack the principles, but there's a link between them. There's a relation between the two. I also noticed as well that the participants of our love story at the beginning reappeared. So Debbie and Omar were the English woman and the Cuban musician. So they've been woven back into the story much later on in the text. So again here, strengthening of semantic density, strengthening of semantic gravity, being specific about particular actors, places, cases, but again, it still continues to strengthen the semantic density. So overall, as we're moving through this text, the thing that jumps out at me is the condensation of meaning across the text. The semantic density continues to increase. It piles up. So it starts with the notion of euthanasia, and then we kind of get, here's some narrative. We'll introduce a little bit of the law and the ethics here, but the density continues to increase. So we start getting, what's the interpretation of these narratives? What's the interpretation of these courses? What are the legal definitions and the legal ethics of these particular perspectives? So the concepts are developed, the complexity increases, and the technical and abstract concepts become more indicative of this really complex, professional, academic, dense knowledge that really may need a lot of unpacking in the classroom. And it just continues to pile up as I read through this text here. So a quick summary of what I'm seeing in this text is that the semantic structures are very different to the first text. I'm seeing movements across all the codes. So I'm seeing that there are, where we're sort of talking about theories and principles in here. This is explained and worked with through the text by movements in semantic density. So it's showing, complex ideas, and it's explaining these concepts ideas. But it's also showing the links to the legal and the medical practice through shifts in semantic gravity as well. So it's talking about these decontextualized ideas and actually really contextualizing them in specific cases and making these connections and links between as well. So quite a complex text to deal with, and I can map it as well. So you may remember before I showed the irrigation text, the green text, sort of waving along, but we can also see that this text has a much greater semantic range happening here. So it starts off in the specific. So it sort of starts, nice and specific, the story of the love story, but very quickly it sort of jumps up into this specialized interpretation through the legal idea. And as it moves through the text, we've got all these peaks and troughs and peaks and troughs and the peaks and troughs. The peaks are often the specialized terminology, the abstract principles, okay? And then often these principles are often contextualized through cases or narratives or examples throughout the text. So what I'd be noticing here is that, well, if I'm going to try and teach this text, I just need to focus perhaps a little bit more on the waving. Probably not going to get through all of this text. I may have to select elements of this text. And this is where the teacher and the expert comes in. So what's the purpose of using this text in the class? Are we looking at the way that these principles have been enacted in these particular practice or these cases? And I might choose a couple of these waves and work with these waves in the class. So moving on into the scientific discourse. So brain insulin signaling and Alzheimer's disease, current evidence and future directions. I read that and I went, yeah, okay, I can do this. And then I had a look at the abstract and straight away I went, wow, okay, there's the degree of abstraction and complexity here is wow. It's like meeting an impenetrable wall. So for me, the thing that jumps out straight away is what range do the students need to understand this text? The questions that I would be asking myself as a teacher is what's gone before? Okay, so have we actually been talking about insulin and Alzheimer's disease before? What types of prior knowledge, what schema do we expect the students to bring to this text? And what is this actually building towards? So building towards, understanding scientific discourse, or are we using this for another purpose? And if we're using it for another purpose, then what types of meanings may be required for the students to take away from this reading? So I could go through this whole text and do it all, do a lot of analysis, but I got this text about 3 or 4 days ago. I haven't had time to go through it all, but I am going to show you just some of the features of the abstract, the wall that hit me when I was looking at it. So some of the key language features here. Now, I started sort of like a bit of a messy, sort of loose annotation of the text. And you can see that I've got some red lines, and what I'm trying to do here is my red lines are trying to identify the main clauses, the main information in here. So there's complex sentences, but for the main information, I don't need it all. So I've got, I think there are 4 clauses in there that I picked out as the main clauses underlined in red. The next thing that I did was I had a look and I said, okay, there's a lot of this technical sort of sciencey language, the intranasal method, the blood-brain barrier, 3-4 word groups. Okay, not too bad, but I'd probably have to think about those a little bit, unpack those a little bit myself to understand them. But then we start getting these much, much more complex ones. Increased central nervous system insulin action. So 6 words in there, a lot of complex relations between these terms, a lot of classification of these happening here. And to understand the relations here, I've got to think, what is this insulin action of the system? Oh no, it's the central nervous system insulin tells me the type of action. Okay, so I really need to be thinking very carefully about unpacking and understanding that as well. And then there are other ones that I looked at, I've got absolutely no idea. The phosphorylation of tau, okay, I've got no idea. It's got an ation at the end, I know it's a noun. TAU, is that even English? I've got no idea. Okay, so what I'm seeing here is I've got some key language features. I would think about this from a structural element. I think, okay, I've got an abstract here. Is this a typical abstract? Does it go through stages of an introduction, a research significance, a methodology, a results, a conclusion? I've got a question mark there because when I look at it, no, it doesn't. It doesn't seem to be following that type of structure. So I'd have to do more work to look at, what's the structure here. And this would be valuable because the abstract, as we know, is kind of a summary. There's a reason why it's the abstract. It's got to, explain to the students. So the density in the abstract is unpacked as we read through the article. So, moving backwards and forwards from the text back to the abstract. So we can see the complex noun groups. There's very uncommon sense taxonomies in here. There's very complex relations within, between, and across the concepts here. It's a relatively high semantic flatline. There's not a lot of unpacking of these terms. There's not a lot of specific examples of these terms. And I would suggest here that there's a lot of work. There's more work for me to do to understand the knowledge in this text. And I think that the students would need lots of help unpacking and repacking of meanings. But this is me making the assumption that students have got no understanding of this whatsoever. Now, I may be wrong. Students may have worked on this previously. They have an existing knowledge structure that allows them to enter and access and understand this text more. So again, I could look at this one. I could say, okay, what types of semantic structures am I seeing? Well, I'm seeing this theory. I'm seeing these principles. There's movements in the semantic density as I move through the text. And there's also, there's links to, didn't change that one. Okay, so you can see it's got legal and medical practice here, but there are strengths in the semantic gravity as well. So what I would say is that the high semantic flatline that was in here is more characteristic of an expert text, but there is some limited movement across. So what's happening here in the legal and the scientific discourse? Well, I could read this text from a novice perspective. And I could say, okay, euthanasia, and I could read through this text and I could pull out a few examples. I could say, oh, euthanasia is this, euthanasia is to do with the brain, here are a few parts of the brain, and I could generate kind of like a simple conceptual understanding of this text. But obviously that's not what we want. We don't want this novice understanding with very loose links between it. We want the students to be developing this more theoretical and conceptual understanding of the topic. And so to do that, they need these integrated and hierarchical networks. We also perhaps need them to think about the practical as well. So what is it about why are we reading this text? How is it going to help us as practitioners, medical practitioners as well? Now, my pedagogic choice is I may push more towards the theoretical. Given that this has a higher semantic flatline, I'd be thinking, let's go towards the theory. Let's maybe stay away from the practical. Let's not, let's not confuse it and make it too complicated as well. So that's kind of how I came to this understanding of the relational differences between a text. So I can see that I've got what's called a heuristic translation of semantic density in the discourse of these texts. Okay, and again, the semantic density is a very abstract principle. It needs to be contextualized within particular objects of study, in our case, working with text. So now I can kind of say, all right, so the technicality that we have is extremely dense, and we can see that through the examples in the discourse. The specialized and the legal and the ethical discourse, it's also dense. Okay, but the difference is that I can kind of look at some of these words and I can have a stab at the meaning. Okay, I can weaken the semantic density to the generalized processes and participants. And these ones I'm much more confident that I understand what's happening in these ones. So acquisition, consolidation, and recollection of new information that came from the text about euthanasia. Sorry, the text about the medical discourse. So I can read that and go, yeah, we learn, we consolidate, we recollect information. So that's okay. I can sort of unpack that a little bit. Then in the semantic density, the weakest semantic density, we've got the idea of the specific people happening here. Now, thinking about this again, not 100% happy with that coding. And the reason I'm not 100% happy is because these particular specific professionals, there's a reason why they've been selected. So there is some sort of density happening there. Again, I'm working with texts. In working with texts, we often change our understanding of the text we work with them. But by talking with students about this, by working with it, by unpacking the meanings and repacking the meanings together, we're building our understanding of texts and how things work. So we've looked at the coding, we can come back and now we can look at the waves, we can sort of map the changes. So we've seen our irrigation text, there's a wave there, it's quite subtle, okay? But teaching this to the students actually required a lot of unpacking. I'm moving to the euthanasia text. We can see here the semantic range is greatly increased. So in this one here, if I were to teach this text, I would be perhaps chatting to the content expert. Why have we chosen this text? What are the key concepts here? I might select a few of these key concepts and explore how they're unpacked in the text. And through unpacking, we would often then move on to the stage of repacking. I would think about the semantic wave. So to go through the unpack to the repack, move on to the next concept. And then ultimately we have a look at our last text here, which you can see if I map this. Yes, there are dips down into specifics, okay, but as a whole, the text is operating at a very high technical level. So that high semantic flat line is in there. So again, the semantic profiles of this text sort of says, okay, yep, there's a lot of unpacking that needs to happen with this text. So you can kind of see here that the tools that I've been using, so the codes and the waving, has allowed me to sort of access the knowledge in these texts, okay, and to conceptualize ways in which I might select particular elements of these texts and how I might go about unpacking and teaching and learning these in a particular classroom. I think we can ultimately all sort of, I can consolidate this by saying that we need this weaving, we need the waving, we need a semantic weaving to move our students from a novice or this very sort of simplistic understanding of what we're reading. If we want to get them to the professional knowledge, we need to move, we need to strengthen and weaken the semantic gravity and semantic density. How we do that is the pedagogic choices that we have. It depends on the students that we're working with. It depends on the text we're working with and the purposes that we are, working with this text. So ultimately, you can surf the waves. You can't stop the waves, but you can learn to surf on them. And it's kind of our job here to sort of get in the water with the students, not to stand on the beach and shout at them and say, catch that wave, good, good, dump. Okay, no. We sort of need to be in there working with them, sort of holding their hand, moving them up and down together. So with the semantic waves, another way to think about this is often we do need to start on smaller waves. Okay, students have got to learn to surf before you throw them out into the bigger waves as well. So the time it takes students to learn to surf depends on what they bring to the text as well. So I'm in no ways saying that novices cannot learn to surf big waves. They can. Okay, but it's our job to take them through, and the way that we do that is through semantic waving, and we can do that through unpacking and repacking our texts. So kind of to wrap this up, the concept of semantic waves, it helps make expert knowledge more accessible to novices. By varying the context of the concept, we can build links with much more concrete examples. By connecting technical and specialized terminology used in activities or in readings, we need to connect them with simpler meanings. And this helps them to unpack the concepts and to repack them in more complex contexts. And this encourages this knowledge acquisition or development and the cumulative knowledge building that we want to see our students developing over a course and over their higher education. It also promotes developing that complexity, understanding the knowledge of one concept. So we've got to make sure they understand one concept before progressing to the next, otherwise we may lose them. And it also helps novice develop understandings of both abstract concepts and the mastery of the technical meanings as well. So it's a nice sort of wrap up there. Now, the ways I do also want to share with you some examples of the ways that I would actually surf the way that I can do this in class. So one way that we can do that is through, for example, tables. So as the tables are unpacked, we can record information in tables. So this can either be done on a board. I've done this on a board, as you saw earlier with my very, very first text. This can also be done through a shared Google Doc. You can get the students to do it as groups. Now, one thing that I would recommend here is that before you go into class, you need to think about the nature of your content. You need to think about which columns you want. So this particular text comes from a biology text that's talking about the line of defense. It's talking about the skin, the mucous membrane, the cilia. It's a biology text. Then it has a description of this concept, okay? But then it also unpacks what it does. Now, in this particular lesson, the teacher would have done all this unpacking, and then they probably would have got the student to copy this text down. Okay, the student needs to be actively engaged in this, and I would recommend that just them taking a photo is probably less likely for them to be, because you've done the unpacking, not them. And if you want them to repack it, they're going to have to do, you know, some sort of active engagement there as well. So tables is a good way for unpacking and repacking. Another one that I've used a lot is concept maps, and not just a rough sort of semantic web kind of idea, a very specific type of concept map that is composed of concepts written in boxes. They're connected with arrows that are labeled to indicate the relationship between the concepts. And these connections are called links. So each concept link concept forms a proposition that can be read as a standalone meaningful expression. So there's often a lot of work that can be done here. How do we connect these concepts? And we can often develop a lot of the cross links as well. And as we saw before, the cross links are sort of the indicative of this more sort of theoretical and conceptual understanding. So the more cross links you can see in a concept map, the greater density, the weaker the gravity, the better the understanding of these texts. Now, the best software that I found for this is one called CMAP. software, and they have a lot of great stuff in there. There's a lot of interesting papers that use this. These can be generated by the students or the groups. Another way that I've used this is expert skeleton maps. So I've worked with lecturers in business and law, and together we have created these expert skeleton maps. Basically, we've just taken out a few of the concepts, and then in the class, we would allow the students to kind of work with the words and the concepts and put them into the right place in there as well. So depending on the time, the level, what you're aiming to do, you can sort of do that as well, just to guide them. Don't expect them to be able to do it perfect the first time. And another thing I always say to them is the concept map is never finished. We can always keep working, rearranging, and looking at that. But I highly recommend this particular website, really, really useful. Another way, once you've sort of perhaps read into an understanding of the waves a little bit more, and a lot of the LCT members of the LCT community often do a lot of mapping of language onto waves. So they'll look at the text and they'll go through and they'll say, okay, what is it about this particular part of the text? What is it about the language here? And where can I place that on the profile as well? So my final thing that I'd like to say, look, there are lots of different ways of working with text. So we can talk about things like the teaching and learning cycle. We're going through these stages of deconstruction and field building, talking about the purpose of the text and guided annotation of the text. But we can also use semantic waves to scaffold the student development of key concepts. Now, we don't have to use semantic waves explicitly. Okay, and very often in class, I've never spoken about semantic waves. I've spoken about waves, okay, and I've spoken about complexity and abstraction because these seem to be a little bit more accessible for my students. It's about developing some sort of shared understanding of what we're talking about. And as I said, if my students are 5, 6 IELTS, I'm not going to hit them with some very complex conceptual understanding. Now, having said that, I would love to work with some students that would allow me to operate with slightly higher, semantic range, and would allow me to actually label the phenomena, probably take, shortcut a lot of the knowledge building that I need to do. So ways that we can sort of build our semantic waves, so through discussions, unpacking and repacking, the relations between them, generating taxonomies through tables, concept maps, or semantic waves. Ultimately, in LCT, we do say only use as much theory as your audience can handle, okay? So the way that I could say that is you might choose to just use semantic gravity, or you might just choose to have a look at semantic density. Don't try and use it all in one go. Choose something that works for you in the text, what's sort of jumping out at you. I've included a few selected references here at the end. Just for further reading and some of the references that I've used throughout the text as well. So there, I would like to invite any questions or comments or discussions and thinking about, how perhaps this might help you guys work with text yourself.
Thank you, Daniel. That was so useful. I think for many of us, when we're getting into text like that, just trying to understand the process of how you would look at increasingly complex texts and go about breaking it down at that first level before you think about how you're going to teach it to your students. I think it's really exciting to see that process, and you showed us such variations in the kinds of texts used, from more simple to sort of the incredibly complex ones. Thanks for working on texts that I think Mark shared with you maybe a week ago. It was so exciting to see how quickly you could use those texts and unpack them and apply semantic gravity and density to that, a whole new bunch of texts which you aren't familiar with pretty much straight away. So thank you so much for that. Lots of useful concepts, I think, that many of us can use in our classrooms and certainly think about.
Those two texts, the first one on euthanasia was relevant to the IEM modules that we do here. And the second on the brain and brain insulin was very relevant to a module which is about writing, scientific writing, introduction to scientific writing. So yeah, I mean, our tutors, they have to deal with, that kind of level of reading and reading into writing. So I think, when we've recorded this session, it's going to be so useful for the staff. We'll put it up on our journal, as soon as, and that's going to be launched in December. We'll also send the link out, and I think that you're probably going to have quite a few people contacting you, Daniel, after this for some advice on teaching with very complex texts.
It's ultimately it's having the tools to be able to work, I think, as well. And it's the tools that can make our work a little bit easier. I'm not going to lie, when I first read those texts, they did sort of scare me a little bit, and I thought, what am I doing? What's happening with these texts? What am I going to do with these texts? But then I sort of thought about my tools, and went, okay, I've got some tools to work with it, and I know that they work. I've used them before in a variety of different contexts across a variety of different disciplines. And so I have faith in the tools, and just by using them a little bit, playing around with it, the meaning started to become clear. So particularly the euthanasia text, I was able to, after quite a bit of sort of working through that text, just by putting together the slides and even just selecting small snippets of those, I was able to sort of carefully select, and sort of that was giving me a better understanding of what the text was doing, how the meanings were unfolding, what its purpose was, and gave me insight into the structure. And the same with the other one as well. Although it was very dense and very sort of, challenging to understand, a few little tools really, really helped me with it.
Letitia's got a hand up.
Yeah, but there is a there's a question in the chat, is there?
Oh,
it's a thank you. Okay. Yeah, I don't want to jump in if anyone else wants to ask a question. I've used, Daniel, I've used your video on writing reflection, which is absolutely brilliant and so easy to use. It's on the same concepts, and it guides students to connect knowledge and the literature to their personal experience when they write a reflection. And so I found that super useful. The students get it in 5 minutes. I get them to then chart a text that I give them, and they do it on big paper to put on the boards or on whiteboards around the class. But then what I would like you to talk a bit more about is how you then go back into, apply these as students write their own text, as they write, let's say, an assignment in your modules. How do you then support them to see those same concepts in their text and to increase them or adjust semantic gravity, etc.? I think that might be very useful for everyone to hear.
Definitely. So if I just understand the question, it's sort of how can we kind of make that circle? So moving from the construction to not only the joint construction, but mainly the independent construction. So when students are writing their own text for to submit to you as an assignment. Definitely. So the independent construction, we might work through draft stages, for example. And so the students would write a draft, and then we might have a look at the drafts together. And then we might go back to the model, and we'd sort of say, okay, in this text, we needed to have, for example, you need some technical vocabulary to show your understanding of, or you need some specialized vocabulary, or you need some general, or you need some specific. And so what I might do is simple color coding. So I would say that, green, yellow, red, okay. And I would say to the student, all right, I want you to have a look through your text, and I just want you to color code what's happening in your text. I've used this a lot for critical reflection, which you mentioned. So I would often use a simple analogy. I would say to the students, okay, so you've got the blue sky is the abstract thinking. So use blue for all of your theory. And then we've kind of got the green grass at your feet is the specific. It's what you're looking down at as well. So use the green for the specific. And then you've also got the sun on the horizon, or the yellow flowers on the ground and the field out there as well. So kind of you're looking out, you're looking around you, we can kind of see that yellow. So that's your generalized concepts as well. And when teaching critical reflection, I've got the students to go back through their texts and basically to mark up what's happening where. And then it allows the students to visually see, oh, actually, I don't have a lot of theory where I'm meant to have the theory. Okay,
Mhm.
or I'm not actually connecting the two. I've got a lot of blue, I've got a lot of green, there's no real yellow happening in my text. And I'm saying, well, so basically what's happening there is you've got one flat line followed by another flat line. So high semantic flat line of theory, then you're dropping down and you've got a low semantic flat line down at the bottom. And the students can intuitively understand that and go, oh, I need to connect them a little bit more. And by visualizing it, by showing it, they conceptually understand what they need to do. So color coding works really nicely, working with drafts, using it as a feedback, and constant recycling, I think, as well, is really, really important.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, I can see that happening in my teachings, certainly. And that idea that they get it intuitively, yeah, also is something that I've observed many times. Thank you.
Do we have any other questions that anyone would like to ask? I actually was, just in case, I'll just let anyone who wants to think about what they'd like to ask, just think a little bit while I ask my questions from Daniel, which is about that last text, right? I was really interested in how you talked about, your typical abstract and how that text deviated from that in terms of what it was trying to do. So this is the Alzheimer's and insulin text. And I just thought, how would you go about trying to map that? Would you point that out to them, talk about things like the structure of the abstract in terms of how the genre of that text might work, for instance, in the same way that you did with irrigation text, classification or taxonomy, and the same way that you did with the euthanasia text, where you talk about the narrative shifting to a different type of genre. So would you do the same thing? Would you enter through genre?
I think there's definitely a potential for that. So not really knowing what came before. So as I said, a big question that I have there is what had come before. So if we had seen some other sort of papers before that had that more sort of, archetypal, stereotypical kind of abstract, it'd be interesting to do a comparison between it as well. And so we'd be able to look at it and say, okay, so this is a text we've looked at before, and this is the text we've got here, do a comparative kind of analysis and sort of talk, work with the students and work through it. So yeah, coming at it from a genre understanding, looking at the staging of this particular, or the phasing within this particular stage as well, I think that'd be quite useful for the students, and it, might raise some interesting questions and some discussions.
Okay, thank you. Xiaofang, you have some questions?
Yes, thank you, Daniel, for the great talk. It's very interesting and very promising. I mean, the tools that you introduced in this talk, I think, are very interesting, and I think it has a great potential for us as language educators. So my question is actually related to Namala's question. I'm wondering, are you aware of any research which combines the semantic density and gravity with the genre pedagogy in teaching reading and writing?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because I'm thinking, because I'm looking at the text you shared with us just now, the analysis about the scientific abstract. So I'm teaching a academic writing course. So I'm using the genre theory to analyze the abstracts, like from introduction to conclusion and everything. So I'm thinking, well, I listened to your talk. I think this is so useful for me. I mean, it's quite interesting. I mean, if we can combine the two different tools together in teaching reading or writing. So what's your suggestion or comment?
There's a lot of great research out there, particularly in science, which of drawing the two frameworks together. Just I think earlier this year, there was an LCT book series. They've just released one on scientific discourse. So specifically looking at basically extending both our SFL and LCT understanding of scientific discourse. From memory, there are 3 parts in this book. The first one kind of looks at the SFL understanding of language and how we can actually extend our understandings through engagement with LCT. The second part looks at how LCT has been extended through insights from SFL. And then the third part shows how the two can be, very complementary and how they can be enacted for science education. So perhaps that's a great place to start, is the LCT book series, the most recent one, Science, Knowledge, Language, and Pedagogy, I think.
I just put it in. It's the Teaching Science, Knowledge, Language, and Pedagogy. Is that
Mhm.
right, Daniel? That one, the most
The
recent
one,
one, right?
that's
Made
the
by
one.
Doran. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. So I'm sort of working my way through this at the moment, and yeah, there's some really, really useful advances in SFL, particularly looking at the discourse semantic level, and looking at how discourse semantic and field can be related right down to the language itself, and that's often been in discussion with, or that's written by scholars that are using both LCT and SFL. So check out the book.
Thank you.
We have another question in the chat box as well. Daniel?
Yes, okay, so let's have a look in terms of preparing how to apply these tools and working with text.
Chaofang, I'll check if that book is available in the library, and if not, I'll order it. Because they usually have, because the Routledge editions, if I'm not mistaken, they usually have the online version. So you can just download the whole book or chapter by chapter once the university has access.
Okay, so I've got a question talking about essential knowledge on language features. So the ways that I've often worked with the way language works is to draw on my knowledge of SFL and to talk about what you call transitivity. So transitivity is often at the language, or we can look at the clauses in a text. And so we would be going through and we'd be saying, okay, language realizes our understanding of the world, and so we can talk about it's we have people, we have participants, which can be people and things, we have the activities in which they engage, which are the processes, our verbs or our verb groups, and these interact together in locations or circumstances as well. So one way that I give them the essential knowledge of language features is to move beyond word class into a functional understanding. So most of the students that I've taught come into class, they use the word noun, verb, adjective, but they're completely unaware of the function of these words. So I have to do quite a bit of work building on their understanding and say, okay, a noun is a thing, a person, and a place, but let's have a look at it in the context. So my analysis of perhaps the first text was where that was most visible. So I'd, you just use some simple color coding. You might use red for the verb, blue for a participant, and green for a circumstance, and just have a look through some of the texts here, and do a color coding. In the classroom, I've often, created shared docs, and I give, we do a text together. So I might do the first one paragraph as a class with, guided construction and deconstruction, and then I would send the students off into groups to have a look. The thing that I found really useful of it really gives me a really good understanding of just what level my students are at. And again, some students pick it up quite intuitively, others struggle a bit with it. And that just sort of gives me an indication of where I might need to allocate a little bit more time in class. And the levels of complexity as well. I often start quite simple, and then once they can sort of work with these sort of clauses, I'll push them a little bit further, and we'll start looking at the complex clauses as well. But it's always contextualized, so I don't work just with the grammar or just with the word class. And we're always sort of moving between the the strata and the meta functions, and trying to look at them and think about them from many, many different perspectives. I think SFL is integral to the process. Well, SFL is a tool that has worked for me. Okay, so I'd like to preface that by saying that I did study at Sydney University with a lot of the people in the field, and I consider myself very lucky to have done so. SFL is one of many tools that's out there. It's not the only tool. It's one that has worked for me. And the reason, I think, is because of the explanatory power that it offers to work with real discourse. And so for me, it's integral to the process, but there's lots of, I've got lots of colleagues that, do great work in the classroom and they don't have a lot of understanding of SFL. So once again, I'm sort of going to hedge that a little bit there, and I'll say SFL is useful, but there is, you've got to buy into it, and you've got to, there's a bit of work that needs to be done to be able to use it confidently in the classroom.
I think just adding to that, that's one of the amazing things about LCT is that you can actually sort of dabble around with it, use it in the classroom, use it immediately once you've read maybe your first introductory article on semantic waves, like the one that you and Richard wrote. Just straight away think about how can I use this to analyze a text and then show it to my students. I mean, I certainly do it in 10 minutes with my students, and they are using it to analyze absolutely everything. I even do the same thing with another tool with axiological clusters. I just do it in real time with them, and they write essays about it immediately because they find, oh, it's quite intuitive, but also intuition with a system behind it. So they can justify the choices that they're making with that analysis. So I think that's what's amazing about LCT is that you can enter at different levels. Whereas I think with SFL, there's definitely a lot more work to do, and a lot more reading and a lot more, it takes a bit more time, I think, particularly when you were talking about things like complex nominal groups and you're talking about transitivity. It takes a little bit more time to feel comfortable with being able to do that kind of analysis. But certainly semantics is one, I think, that you can enter into any text with that and feel fairly certain through a certain amount of intuitive knowledge of how you can use it straight away. So that was really useful to see how you transition between those two types of theories and then bring them together, but also show the potential in your texts for how you can use one and not the other is, I think, really useful for all of us.
Can I just add to that, Namala?
Yeah, sure, go ahead, Mark.
I think what was really interesting was how you were showing how, complexity is added to nominalizations. And you were talking about the hierarchies in the taxonomies. And, the semantic density wave shows that quite nicely, although it's heuristic. Students can really, I think, they can get a lot of meaning from that. So rather than us just talking about hierarchies in semantic meaning, we can give a visualization of it. We can heuristically map it, can't we, as our knowledge develops. And I think you can even get students to do that themselves as activities, perhaps.
Definitely.
As a part of repacking.
Yeah, I've sort of used that before, and I would often, with the students that I worked with, they'd come in with, we'd be working with individual lexical items. And so, for example, like a verb have, and we'd be talking about it, and I'd be saying, well, how many understandings, how many ways can you use this verb have? And they'd say, I have a brother. I'm like, okay, great. What's another way? I'm having dinner. Okay, all right, good. So that's 2 different meanings as well. And then I'd often say, well, let's have a look in the dictionary. Let's just see how many different ways. And the student's jaw drops when it hits about 60 different meanings or something like that. But it's, it's sort of like a nice way of, just making it, presenting it to it in a tangible way that student can understand it, rather than just going, oh, I need 60 meanings, or I need to learn 60 meanings. Like, no, it's about the context. It's about expanding your meaning potential. It's about building, you don't need to jump to that, the end of the, with that lovely sort of Whiffley diagram where it just, let's start with 1 and then let's move to 2 and then let's move to 3 and, build it up sequentially, and, you'll get there, as long as you're understanding the principles of where you're going, the principles of where you're heading. It gives them a framework to download the knowledge, I guess, that they're encountering.
I think it's also useful to use it the other way around as well. I don't know whether Chaofang has this, where his students are experts in the field and you're kind of teaching them the language or making them aware of the language that they use in the field, but you're not the expert, they're the expert in the field. So that's really interesting for us as well, because Letitia and I have worked a lot on 3MT, so 3-minute thesis, where you've got exactly that, where you've got the students are experts and then they have to try and unpack that expertise to a non-specialist audience, and then showing them the way from a slightly different perspective. You have all this knowledge, and how do you unpack that knowledge for your audience is also really interesting. Sorry, Chaofang, you got your hand up again.
Yeah, I was just thinking about Letitia's question, how corpus can be combined sort of with the semantic waves theory and analysis framework. So I was thinking that perhaps I'm not sure. So maybe I would like to ask Daniel also, in your research, do you find, is there any sort of correlation between such as a language pattern with the higher semantic density or lower semantic density, or is there any correlation between formulaic language, lexical phrases, or lexical patterns which can be taught to students so that they can use it to what do you call repack, right? The sort of language that they would like to attend in the module. Thank you.
Simple answer is yes, definitely. I think there's a lot of great stuff that corpus linguistics can teach us. It's a very powerful tool to look at large slabs of discourse that we'd probably be unable to enter ourselves as well. And I think that there's a lot of potential for LCT to give insight into corpus linguistics and how we can sort of work with the data and the knowledge that we've got in these data banks. So simple answer, yes. I'm not familiar with a lot of research in that area. I have read some stuff in it as well. So for example, talking about the types of lexical bundles that you're getting and whether the lexical bundles that you're actually pulling out of a corpus do actually have any density in them, because obviously not all of them do.
This is exactly what we should be looking at. We need Taofang to come into the LCT SIG. Because that's exactly, because as you've seen, it's very qualitative at this moment, right? There's not a lot of a large data set or quantification, but definitely in order to look at correlation between language patterns and the different semantic gravity levels, we would need some of your tools, Taofang, to, so basically it's a whole problem to solve how this can be done. For SFL, they have a sort of, they have a couple of software that will do automatic kind of coding from large data set, but I don't think anything really works very well. The Madrid, I never remember the name of that tool. But there might be, yes, from your field, Taofang, some stuff that can be exploited, and it would be very interesting to look at that.
Definitely. Yeah, I think the complementarity of that, the LCT, the way that it gives an alternative sort of lens, a way of looking at language and knowledge practices, very complementary.
And there's a lot of stuff that's done on density, and as you move up in density, how time, temporality works with it. So there are ways of technicalizing it further as you're looking at lexical bundles. You realize that, if concepts are more gravity bound, as the kinds of things that was in the euthanasia text, the narrative tends to move with temporality, past tenses, whereas you've got the noun groups that work with sort of present tense, sort of timelessness, when you start to abstract more and become more technical and more specialized. So there's different ways of mapping it, which are all really fascinating, I think, that allow you to bring in more of the concepts if you feel that that's something you want to do at that level. So again, it's just about how much of the theory do you need? And I think Daniel, when he finished off, said, how much of the theory do you need? And it's a question about how do you, what do you need to be able to teach your students? What are you trying to get across to them? And how much of the technicality from LCT do you need to build into that? Because there's certainly people expanding it so much now, and it's moving really quickly, isn't it? There's always new papers being published. The LCT Center has an excellent website in which they've got all of the latest publications, a lot of free resources that you can access, a lot of the talks that you can watch. So if there's any specific area of interest, they've got links to that. So there's a lot going on, I think, in terms of accessing the discourse around LCT. Yeah.
And I think there's also a really strong community as well. So opportunities to get together with other, scholars in the LCT community and talk through your ideas. That's a real strength that I've found. I found it really useful to sort of say to someone, oh, look, I'm thinking about this, or I'm doing this talk, or I'm working on this paper, and getting together with them and just talking through ideas. So I've helped friends, and friends have helped me, and it's really, really useful before you get to that kind of finished publication stage. It's really, really useful to have this community of people just to bounce ideas and say, is this kind of working? Am I thinking about it in the right way? Or really helpful.
Yeah, and also just to say, I'm not sure, and can you help me? Because I think it's a new theory that's exciting about that. When it comes to SFL, it feels like so much of it has already been worked out that you need to kind of be an expert to talk to other experts. Whereas with LCT, I think it's really exciting because some of it's just happening right now. So you can actually go in there and say, I'm not sure, and bounce your ideas off different people. And everyone's really, really open, I think, to responding to you. So if you have questions, ask anyone from the community. If you just email them as well, they usually get back to you straight away with responses, which is amazing.
I've just done a plug of an article that I've done myself on corpus linguistics and semantic density. So you might find that really interesting, Xiaofang, actually. Just to quickly share with you, for example, with collocations, different terminology used for collocations. So in semantic density terms, it's called a technical compact element if the term comes after an adjective or a set of adjectives. If it comes before as an adjective rather than a noun, it's called a property. And then this is just one type of word class that's used. And this paper talks about a lot of the work that's been done by Mayton and Duran, 2017. So there's a whole issue actually from the Colombian journal?
Chilean.
Chilean.
You mean Revisto, right?
Yes.
Is that the one? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, so there's a whole, this is it, Onomazine
Revisto Linguistica.
There's a whole
version of Chilean accent in there.
Yeah. So this 2017 publication is dedicated to semantics, semantic density in particular, I think. So you might like that. Yeah.
Thanks, Mark. Very useful.
All right.
Okay, so I think just being mindful of time, it's already on nearly 1:40. So I just wanted to say thank you to everyone. Daniel, we have a little token of appreciation for you. So keep an eye out on your email. We've got a little book voucher for you to use on a book of your choice. And we'll get that to you by next week. And I just want to say thank you so much to Daniel, especially for taking on so many of the texts that we engage with and making it really relevant to our center and the work that we do in EAP. So thank you so much, Daniel. That was a brilliant talk. The resource will be available to everyone. So we'll send out an email when it's available online so that everyone can have a look and use it in their future teaching, etc. Thanks, Daniel. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel.
Thanks.
All
Bye-bye.
right,
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Just waiting to see. Oh, Daniel, I'm holding back just to say that was brilliant. Thank you so much. Oh my goodness. I loved it, loved it, loved it.
It was top class.
Oh, it really was. Sometimes when I hear my own colleagues speak, I'm so thrilled that I know them that I'm like,